April 12, 1945, 14:30 hours, 9 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and their escort of A6M Zero fighters soar over the East China Sea. In the lead bomber, Lieutenant Saburo Dohi puts on his oxygen mask and lies back on his makeshift cot, breathing deeply. His mind is focused on one thing: the new secret weapon held in the bowels of the Betty. A weapon the Japanese hope will change the course of the war. Radio operator Lieutenant Zenji Sugano taps Saburo on the shoulder. His face is solemn. "We've made it. American ships have been spotted below, a pair of destroyers and smaller vessels. The attack is on." Taking a deep breath, Saburo passes through the Devil's Gate and descends into his fate. This is the story of the Thunder Gods, the kamikaze pilots who volunteered to die in rocket-powered bombs. How young men were selected for suicide missions. How they trained knowing each flight could be their last. How they said goodbye to families they'd never see again, and what it felt like in those final moments before impact. This is what it was like to be a kamikaze pilot in World War II. The word kamikaze means divine wind in Japanese. It refers to the typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, saving Japan from conquest. By 1944, Japan was losing the war. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific. Japanese cities were being bombed. The empire was collapsing. Conventional tactics weren't working. Japanese aircraft couldn't match American numbers or technology. Trained pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Japanese military needed a new strategy, something that would multiply the effectiveness of limited resources, something that would terrify the Americans into negotiating peace. They needed the divine wind again. The Kamikaze program began in October 1944. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi created the first kamikaze units in the Philippines. The concept was simple: load aircraft with explosives, crash them into American ships, one pilot, one plane, one ship. The mathematics were brutal but logical. A conventional bombing attack might require 20 aircraft to sink one ship. Maybe half those aircraft would be shot down. Maybe the bombs would miss. A kamikaze attack guaranteed at least one hit. The pilot became the guidance system, human intelligence, human determination, unstoppable once committed. The first kamikaze attacks shocked the Americans. On October 25, 1944, 5 Zero fighters crashed into American escort carriers off Samar. They sank the USS St. Lo, damaged 4 others. Suddenly, every American ship in the Pacific was vulnerable. The program expanded rapidly. By early 1945, thousands of Japanese pilots were being trained for suicide missions. Most were young, barely out of flight school. Some had less than 100 hours of flight time. It didn't matter. They didn't need to know how to land. But the standard kamikaze program had limitations. Zeros and other conventional aircraft were slow, easy to shoot down. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed most kamikaze planes before they reached their targets. The Japanese Navy wanted something better, something faster, something unstoppable. They created the Ohka. The Ohka, meaning cherry blossom, was a rocket-powered flying bomb, a manned missile. The pilot sat in a tiny cockpit surrounded by 2,600 pounds of explosives. 3 solid-fuel rocket motors provided thrust. Once ignited, they pushed the Ohka to speeds over 600 miles per hour, faster than any American fighter could intercept. But the Ohka had one critical weakness: range. The rockets burned for only 10 seconds. The Ohka could glide after burnout, but not far, maybe 50 miles under perfect conditions. That meant a bomber had to carry the Ohka close to enemy ships before release, very close, within range of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Betty bomber was chosen as the carrier aircraft. The G4M was already obsolete by 1945. Slow, poorly armored. American pilots called it the flying lighter because it burned so easily. But it was the only Japanese bomber large enough to carry the Ohka. The plan: Betty bombers would fly to within 20 miles of American ships, release the Ohkas. The rocket-powered bombs would streak toward their targets faster than any defense could stop them. In theory, In practice, it required pilots willing to climb into a flying bomb with no parachute, no ejection system, and no chance of survival. They called themselves the Thunder Gods. August 1944, Takao Airfield, Taiwan. A hot, humid evening. A group of inexperienced naval cadets fresh out of flight school are assembled in a hangar. They sit on tatami mats, awaiting their commander. Barely able to contain their excitement, all they know is they've been summoned for a top-secret undertaking. If they display the required attributes, they will be given control of a single weapon more capable than anything before it. Among the group are cadets Saburo Dohi and Hideo Suzuki, friends and classmates from flight training. Group Commander Captain Junsaku Takahashi enters the room. His face is solemn. If you are married, if you are the only surviving male heir for your family, or if you have only one parent alive, raise your hand. Hands go up around the room. Takahashi watches gravely. You men with your hands raised, leave the room. The stunned silence is followed by looks of confusion and disappointment. Men exit quietly, leaving an ominous crowd of empty seats. The remaining cadets understand the implication. Whatever this mission is, they won't be coming back. Takahashi begins the briefing. He reveals to the cadets that, despite the Japanese propaganda, the war is not going well. The Americans are advancing. Japanese forces are being pushed back across the Pacific. But this weapon could be the answer. It's capable of taking out an American aircraft carrier in one shot. The men are in disbelief. This is a game changer. But Takahashi isn't finished. There's a catch. Operating this weapon is a one-way mission. You will die. The words hang in the air. No one moves. No one speaks. Saburo Dohi and Hideo Suzuki exchange glances, nod to each other resolutely. They are determined to serve Japan at whatever cost. Takahashi stresses the urgency of the project, but he also assures them there will be no shame in backing out. He gives them 3 days to consider, 3 days to decide if they're willing to die. The selection process for kamikaze pilots has been romanticized and misunderstood. Western accounts often claim pilots were forced, that they had no choice, that refusing meant disgrace or execution. The reality was more complex. Yes, there was enormous social pressure. In Japanese military culture, individual life was considered less important than duty to the emperor and nation. Dying for Japan was the highest honor. But most kamikaze pilots, especially in the early program, were volunteers. They chose this. They believed in it. Not because they wanted to die, because they believed their death would save Japan. The propaganda told them American forces would rape and murder Japanese civilians if they invaded. That unconditional surrender meant the destruction of Japanese culture, that only through sacrifice could the homeland be defended. Many pilots wrote letters home explaining their decision. The letters reveal complex motivations: duty, honor, fear for their families, desire to make their deaths meaningful. Some were fatalistic. They'd watched friends die in conventional combat, seen pilots shot down, seen aircraft destroyed. If death was inevitable, better to die taking an American ship than to die for nothing. Others were idealistic, truly believed in the divine mission of Japan, saw themselves as samurai defending the sacred homeland. And some were practical. As one pilot wrote, "I have a 1 in 10 chance of surviving a normal mission. I have a 1 in 1 chance of dying in a kamikaze attack. But if I die, my family will be honored. They will receive a pension. My death will have purpose." The 3 days of consideration passed. Despite the stark requirements of the mission, every cadet present signed up. They became the 721st Naval Air Group. They would soon be known as the Thunder Gods. Hideo and Saburo began training with their fellow cadets. Finally, they discovered what the miracle weapon they would be learning to operate actually was. The Ohka looked like a torpedo with stubby wings, 18 feet long, 16-foot wingspan, tiny cockpit just large enough for one pilot. The design was elegant in its simplicity. Everything existed to deliver the 2,600-pound warhead to its target. No landing gear, no ejection system, no defensive weapons, no parachute, just a cockpit, a warhead, 3 rockets, and a guidance system consisting of 1 human being with approximately 10 seconds to aim before impact. During training, the pilots used unpowered glider versions of the Ohka. the K1 trainer. Same dimensions, same flight characteristics, but no rockets, no explosives. The purpose was simple: learn to fly the Ohka, learn to control it during the dive, learn to aim for the target while pulling G-forces that could cause blackout, then learn to do it while knowing you'll never land again. Despite the brutality of the assignment, Hideo Suzuki is in high spirits before his first training flight. His friend Saburo wishes him luck on the airfield. Hideo eagerly climbs aboard the Betty bomber with his comrades. Once the bomber is cruising at altitude, Hideo climbs down through the bomb bay into the Ohka K1 training glider. The cockpit is cramped, barely enough room to move. The instrument panel is simple: airspeed, altitude, compass, nothing else needed. His knees are almost touching the bulkhead in front of him, the bulkhead that, in the combat version, would be 2,600 pounds of explosive. A rush of adrenaline passes through him, but he fights to remain calm. He confirms that he is ready by announcing into the mouthpiece, "Maintenance preparation, all good." Hideo also taps out in Morse code, an abbreviation of his oral message. The Betty pilot is not to drop the K1 until he has confirmed Hideo's message, and Hideo himself has issued a reply. In the cramped cabin of the glider, Hideo waits. An eternity passes. There's only silence from the Betty's pilot. With no clue what to do next, Hideo frantically starts to repeat his original Morse code message. He's been warned not to force the craft down, but to let it bleed energy until he feels the skid bite. Hideo grits his teeth and follows his training, finally touching down on the ground, skidding along the sandy field. But it will not be an easy landing. The little craft tilts to one side, resting on the wingtip as it comes to a screeching halt. A grin slowly breaks across his face. The successful training flight signals his readiness for the real thing. Training continued through the fall of 1944. The Thunder Gods practiced repeatedly. Learned to control the Ohka during steep dives, learned to compensate for crosswinds, learned to aim while experiencing forces that made their vision blur and their consciousness fade. But before he can finish, there's a deafening bang. The explosive charge detonates prematurely, releases the Ohka from the bomber into a roller coaster dive. The aircraft plunges through the air, immediately pulling hard Gs. Hideo grapples with the joystick as the G-force increases and threatens to overwhelm him. He can feel the weight acting harder and harder on him. His vision narrows, gray tunnels closing in. His eyes slowly start to close. With a jolt, he wrestles the little plane back into level flight. The pressure slowly subsides. Gaining confidence, he sights the airfield, circles it twice before lining up for the final approach. Now, only 3 feet over the airfield, Hideo is inches away from success. They learned the final approach. How to keep the target in sight during those last seconds. How to close their eyes at the moment of impact so they wouldn't instinctively pull up. Some pilots couldn't do it, couldn't overcome the survival instinct. They washed out of the program, reassigned to conventional units. The ones who remained were the ones who could accept death, who could look at it directly and not flinch. After months of intense and nerve-wracking training, the Thunder Gods gathered to celebrate the new year on December 31st, 1944. Having been granted leave, the pilots used this time to reflect on their spiritual values and lives, to prepare for the sacrifice they'd soon be required to make. Saburo and Hideo were among them. The men drank sake, ate special rations, waited for midnight. When midnight arrived, the anticipated sound of the large bronze bell from the Buddhist temple rang ominously throughout the night. Struck by the priests 108 times to mark the suffering caused by the earthly desires of man. The pilots fell into silence as they listened to the deep tolls sounding through the night. As dawn crept closer, the pilots walked to a humble hill known as Tornado Mountain. The normally festive atmosphere was muted by the effects of over 7 years of war. The pilgrims trudged exhaustedly up the mountain. The icy ocean breeze met the bright rays of the sun as it burst over the horizon. The men took a moment to watch the dawn from the heights of Tornado Mountain. Ajiguchi, a pilot from the Thunder Gods that day, later stated, "We drank a cup of sake and shouted, 'Banzai, Banzai, Banzai.' We all knew it would be our final first sunrise." The first Thunder Gods mission launched on March 21, 1945. Target: American ships off Okinawa, 18 Betty bombers, 18 Ohka pilots, 50 escort fighters. None of them reached the target. American fighters intercepted the formation 60 miles from the American fleet. The slow, heavily loaded Betty bombers were easy targets. The escorts fought desperately but were overwhelmed. All 18 Bettys were shot down. All 18 Ohka pilots died without ever launching their weapons, without ever seeing their targets. The Americans called them bakas, fools. The second mission launched on April 1st. Same result. The Bettys were shot down before reaching release range. More Thunder Gods dead. More Ohkas lost. 0 American ships damaged. In April 1945, Saburo Dohi and Hideo Suzuki were becoming impatient and tense. Twice now they had waved off their fellow pilots on missions, watched them take off, watched them not return. These task forces had been annihilated by Allied forces, but Saburo and Hideo were no less eager to jump into action. Finally, the day came when Saburo was assigned to the 3rd Thunder Gods operation. April 12, 1945. Hideo was again left in reserve. At the airbase, Hideo and Saburo said their final goodbyes. Devastated that he was unable to join his friend in combat, Hideo congratulated Saburo on the great honor of dying for the nation, said farewell to his friend for the last time. What happened next would become the only successful Ohka attack of the entire war. April 12, 1945, 14:30 hours. The formation approaches the American radar picket line. Saburo is in the Ohka, suspended beneath the Betty bomber, waiting, his heart pounding. Below, 30 Kamikaze fighters attack the USS Manard El Abele. The destroyer's guns tear through the sky. 1 Zero is destroyed, another driven off. But the third barrels on. The crew scores hit after hit on the remaining plane. But the determined Zero can't be taken out. It slams into the destroyer's starboard side. The bomb it's carrying penetrates the deck and detonates. The ship shudders. Men scream. Fires break out. But the Manard El Abele doesn't sink. Not yet. Above the chaos, Saburo has made his final preparations, taps out a Morse code message that he's ready to launch, waits for the contraption to be dropped from the Betty. But a minute passes. Nothing happens. Cold fear begins to pool in Saburo's stomach. He's suspended helplessly over enemy fire. If the Betty covers much more distance, he'll lose track of his target. Back on board the bomber, the aircraft commander shouts to radio operator Zenji Sugano. The explosive release bolt has misfired. Sugano must manually jettison the rocket bomb. Sugano closes his eyes, unable to bring himself to watch as he releases the weapon. With no warning, Saburo plunges downward through the sky. Despite it feeling like the floor is dropped from underneath him, Saburo desperately follows his training. He activates a dial on the dashboard, shifts his thumb over to a button on the joystick, presses down. He has just activated the 3 solid-fuel rocket motors. An overpowering force, stronger than anything he's felt before, takes hold. He's thrown into the back of his seat. A deafening, unnatural roar drowns out everything. The battle cry of the Thunder Gods has been sounded. The Ohka accelerates to over 600 miles per hour in seconds. Faster than any American fighter, faster than any anti-aircraft gun can track. Saburo is being crushed by the G-forces. His vision narrows. The instrument panel blurs. He can barely move his arms, but he keeps the target in sight, the USS Manard El Abele. Already damaged, already listing from the first kamikaze hit. The seconds stretch. Time distorts at this speed. Everything is rushing and simultaneously frozen. Saburo thinks of Tornado Mountain, the sunrise, the sake, his friends, Hideo. He takes a deep breath and slowly closes his eyes. The 2,600-pound warhead of Saburo's Ohka collides with the side of the ship. The explosion is catastrophic. Having activated the manual launch of Saburo's Ohka, Zenji Sugano has been watching every step of Saburo's journey, sees the tremendous blast. He did it! Saburo's Ohka obliterates the vessel's midsection, buckling the keel, severing all power, lights, and communications. Aboard the ship, water pours in from all angles. Those below deck don't even have a chance to register what's hit them. The Ohka has done its job. The captain of the Manard El Abele gives orders to abandon ship as it breaks in two. The bow and stern drift apart before slipping beneath the waves. Dozens of men are trapped inside. As the stunned survivors cluster in the churning waters, the crew of the nearby destroyer USS Jeffers sights another Ohka zipping toward them. The Jeffers' guns open up, but the Ohka streaks on relentlessly, its pilot unfazed. An explosion rocks the ship, the decks are smashed, but the ship hasn't sunk. At just 50 yards, an anti-aircraft shell had struck the Ohka. The Ohka and its pilot are destroyed before they can even hit the target. Not as lucky as Saburo and his glorious death in the hull of the Manart El Abali. The initial strike by the Kamikazes, the Ohka, and the subsequent strafing kills 83 Americans and wounds 35. The operation is later deemed the most successful use of the Ohka in the war. Saburo would never know that his hit on the Manart El Abali would be the one and only ship sunk by an Ohka. That he had given his life not for a U.S. capital ship, not for the aircraft carrier he'd been promised, but for a small destroyer acting as a radar picket from outside the main fleet. Despite their sacrifice and commitment, Ohkas and their pilots would damage only 6 other U.S. ships in their operations. Of the 74 Ohkas used in action, most were shot down still within the slow, overloaded Betty bombers. Failed attacks, failed missions, failed sacrifices. The Americans nicknamed the Ohka pilots Bakas, fools, yet the dignity of the Thunder God's sacrifice was not lost on those left behind. Men like Hideo Suzuki, who mourned the loss of his friend and the chance to sacrifice himself for the war effort. "I felt that I had missed out on my chance to die for the nation," Hideo would later say. Of the 17 cadets who were assigned to the Thunder Gods alongside Hideo Suzuki, only 2 others survived the war. The Kamikaze program as a whole was more effective than the Ohka. From October 1944 to August 1945, Kamikaze attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged 368 others. But at what cost? Approximately 4,000 Kamikaze pilots died. Most achieved nothing, shot down before reaching their targets, crashing into the ocean, dying for a cause already lost. It was sitting in a cockpit surrounded by explosives, feeling the engine vibrate, knowing that in minutes or hours you'd be dead. It was the final approach, the target filling your vision, the anti-aircraft fire, the tracers, the proximity to death becoming certainty of death. It was the last seconds, the conscious decision to not pull up, to not try to save yourself, to follow through. And then, nothing. Some kamikaze pilots hesitated, pulled up at the last moment, circled back, tried again. Sometimes succeeded, sometimes returned to base with some excuse about mechanical failure. They were shamed, ostracized. Some were executed for cowardice, others never hesitated. Dove straight in, believed completely, died instantly. By April 1945, Japan's defeat was inevitable. The Americans controlled the Pacific. The atomic bombs were being prepared. Surrender was only a matter of time. But the kamikaze pilots didn't know this. Or if they knew, they didn't believe it. They believed their sacrifice would save Japan. What was it like to be a kamikaze pilot? It was knowing you would die. Not might die. Would die. It was writing letters to your family explaining why you chose this, trying to make them understand, trying to make them proud. It was saying goodbye to friends, to parents, to siblings, to sweethearts you'd never marry. It was watching others take off before you, watching them not return, knowing you'd be next. Which was braver? Which was more human? The post-war judgment of kamikaze pilots has been complicated. In Japan, they're remembered as heroes, as tragic heroes perhaps, young men sacrificed by old men in a war already lost. In America, they're remembered as fanatics, as proof of Japanese militarism, as the enemy who would never surrender. Both views miss something essential. They were young men. Most, barely 20 years old, caught in a war they didn't start, told that their death was the only way to save their country, their families, everything they loved, and they believed it, or they felt they had no choice but to believe it. On March 21st, 1948, the surviving Thunder Gods fulfilled their promise to meet at Tornado Mountain, the same mountain they had climbed that New Year's Day in 1945. Hideo Suzuki was there, one of only 3 Thunder God survivors. The men shared cups of hot green tea, bittersweet memories of their friends who gave everything for Japan. They stood where they had watched that final sunrise, where they had shouted "Banzai" and believed they would soon be dead. 3 years later, they were alive. Japan had surrendered, been occupied, been rebuilt, and their friends were gone. Saburo, the others, all dead. For what? That's the question kamikaze survivors lived with for the rest of their lives. The guilt of surviving, the wondering if the sacrifice had meant anything. Japan hadn't been saved. The kamikaze attacks hadn't stopped the Americans. The war had been lost anyway. Their friends had died for nothing. Or had they died for something? For duty? For honor? For the belief that they were protecting their families? Does intention matter when the outcome is failure? These are questions without good answers. What we know is this: being a kamikaze pilot meant accepting death, choosing death, walking toward it with open eyes. Some did it willingly, some did it reluctantly. Some did it because they saw no other choice, but they all did it. And that makes their story worth remembering, not to glorify war, not to celebrate sacrifice, but to remember that war turns young men into weapons, that it asks them to give everything, and that sometimes they do. The thunder gods, the Ohka pilots, the kamikaze, they were fools perhaps, but they were also human beings who believed they were doing something noble, that their deaths would matter, that they would save something worth saving. They were wrong, but they believed, and they died for that belief. That's what it was like to be a kamikaze pilot in World War II.